Let's summarize what we've done in the last few weeks looking at the history of Samaritanism, since we are through with that, looking at it formally. First of all, I would say this in summary, that any discussion, I'm going to give it to you in 4 points, I believe. Any discussion of Jewish Samaritan hostility, which does not take into account pre-monarchical tribal jealousy, doesn't reach back early enough in history. A reference for that, and we've given you several before in the books of Samuel and Kings, would be 1 Samuel 11:8. Second point of summary would be this. I think this will kind of capsulize what we've said over about a month's worth of study now on Samaritanism. The 2 Kings 17 passage introduces the situation of a new ethnicity. That's what makes it important and pivotal for any discussion of the Samaritan people. 2 Kings 17 introduces a situation of a new ethnicity. And we want to be careful lest we read too much of a religious question into 2 Kings 17. Because remember, the people that are left, the northern people that are left into captivity, we have no proof that they are syncretistic in their religion. The people who are syncretistic are the foreigners who are brought in, who are first of all pagan, worshiping their own gods, and then because of the fact that they were being devoured by lions, they desired that someone would teach them the way of the god of the land. And once they learned that, they mingle that with the pagan religion they had already brought in. And then later on, in a period of several hundred years, and we don't have the details on this, the paganism or the syncretism of their worship drops out. And as it is developed over the next few centuries, you end up with Samaritanism of the ITP New Testament form. So what we have, in other words, is a new ethnicity. We've got, we don't have pure Jewish people here. Basically, the 2 Kings 17 passage is letting us know that we've got a new situation of a different type of people. In other words, intermarriage. Intermarriage between the foreigners and the remnants of the northern kingdom, those who were still there after the 722 fall of the capital city of Samaria. Ethnicity. Ethnic. You know what ethnic is, an ethnic background, like a Puerto Rican or Chinese or something. Well, the new ethnic background would be the foreigners. They're not Jewish people. New ethnicity, a new ethnic background. So it's an ethnic background that's being brought in. And it's true that there's a religious being brought in too, but remember, the religious, which is paganism, passes off the scene over the next few hundred years. But you can't ever get rid of the fact that you've got a different blood in you. That will remain with you forever. So it's the new ethnicity that's the situation of 2 Kings 17, and not so much the question of new religion. Now, don't misunderstand me. I just said that, yes, new religion does come in the form of paganism, but that passes off the scene, because the Samaritans are not pagans. The Samaritans, as we know them, as they become in the ITP, the intertestamental period, which is what we're studying in the New Testament period, are simply not pagans. They have a pure form of worship. Now, I'm going chronologically in order here. The number 3, a third point of summary. Yes?
That religion passing off the scene, that happened after the exilic period again, right?
Well, we don't know when that happened.
Okay.
We know that it happened somewhere between 722 and the middle of the 6th century, whenever Zerubbabel is coming back. We know it's somewhere in that 200-year period. You've got about 200 years for it to happen. Because if those people were still pagans, whenever Zerubbabel comes on the scene and they ask to rebuild the temple, Zerubbabel would have obviously said, well, of course not, you're pagans. But they said what? We worship God as you do. And Zerubbabel didn't dispute that. So somewhere between 722 and just say 522, that's a little too late, but that makes it easy to remember. Somewhere between 722 and 522, that syncretistic business passes off the scene.
Somebody that is syncretistic
Well, from the point of view of true religion, yes, you've either got it or you don't, one or the other. You're either for God or against Him. But as we're using it here, we mean that you're combining true worship with false worship. But at the end of the day, you either have it or you don't. If you've got any form of false worship, you've got false worship. Because, as Paul teaches in the New Testament, leaven is going to leaven everything out. Okay, number 3 then, a third point of summary. The context of the returning exiles offers the first formal disagreement and alienation. The context of the returning exiles offers the first formal disagreement and alienation. Ezra 4, verses 1 to 2. Passage for number 2 would be 2 Kings 17, which was part of the statement. Ezra 4, verses 1 to 2. Now, what I said whenever we discussed Ezra 4, 1 to 2 was we have to be careful not to read into Ezra 4 any earlier adversarial or hostile position or situation. They are called the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin in Ezra 4, 1 to 2. But that's adversaries because the writer, Ezra, of the book is looking back on the time of Ezra 4, 1, and they do show themselves at that time to be adversaries. We don't have any proof that they were adversaries earlier because there would be nothing to be adverse to. These exiles are just returning. You had no one to cause you problems or for you to cause problems any earlier. So the context of the returning exiles, 536 BC, offers the first formal disagreement and alienation. And we don't have, still at this time, the, quote, Samaritans, unquote. But we've got people of the northern kingdom who put themselves in the position of becoming adversaries to those returning to the south and attempting to rebuild the temple. Ezra 4, 1 and 2. And then finally, number 4, and I think this should sum up everything that I've said thus far, the intertestamental period, which you know now as ITP. You've seen enough tapes with that on it to know how to abbreviate that. The intertestamental period provides the final irreconcilable, irreversible estrangement between the two with the building and destruction of the rival Samaritan temple. In other words, that puts a period to all discussion, all discussion of any type of reconciliation. The intertestamental period provides the final, irreversible, irreconcilable estrangement with the building and the destruction of the rival Samaritan temple on Gerizim. Now, if you've got those 4 points, you have everything that we've said thus far. Although we probably did about a message on each one of those, though. Not exactly. I had some introductory things to say. Maybe 3 and 4 were kind of in one study together. But if you've got that, then you should completely understand everything that I've said thus far about Samaritanism and Samaritan history. In other words, those are 4 things that are in such need of highlighting because they serve as pegs that you hang everything else upon. Several centuries of time separate each one of these, 1 from 2, 2 from 3, 3 from 4. At least 2 centuries separate each of these. So in 2 Kings 17, we've got a new ethnicity. In Ezra 4, we've got the first real, formal, documented, we could say, disagreement between remnants of the north and returnees to the south. We're not going to call them any names. We don't know any names except the northern people and the southern people. They're not called Samaritans then. Then whenever you get into the ITP, the intertestamental period, there is where you really have the meat of the issue. There's where you have all of your material. Specifically, the building of the temple, and of course when the Jews knew that they had built a temple, well, that just was it as far as they were concerned. And then whenever the Jews came up and destroyed that temple, well, then as far as the Samaritans were concerned, it was just it. It was over with. There's no reconciling of the two. So the ITP, the building, the destruction of the temple, proved to be very, very important. Now, if you don't have, you do.
Referring to is the Samaritan.
Yes, which we're going to discuss even tonight. If you don't have any further questions, that's all I'm going to say about their history. Now what I want to come to are their religious beliefs and practices. Their religious beliefs and practices that we're going to do just tonight. We'll do it in one study. And hopefully next time we'll be looking at Jesus' attitude toward the Samaritans. So then we'll have the opportunity of using many, if not all, depends on how far we can go in one study, of the New Testament passages that speak about the Samaritans. Now, the earliest phase of their religion, which really begins to develop somewhere between Malachi and Matthew, the intertestamental period, centered around the concept of oneness. Oneness, just like it sounds, oneness. And I want to give you several examples of this. Oneness may be the best term to use just to give an overall description of their religion, best as far as easy to remember. And then I'll show you what I mean, the various branches of this oneness of their religion. Number one, they had a belief in one God. Everything about them was one. This is the way at least I think best to teach it and describe it. They had a belief in one God, known as monotheism. Mono meaning one, and theism meaning the worship of God. You say, why did he take the time to explain such a simple word like that? He must have something on his mind. Well, something on my mind would be to ask you the question, are you a monotheist?
Yes.
Why is it whenever I ask the question, you know you're supposed to pause, then give a laugh, and then snicker afterwards? Well, you can go home tonight thinking about that. Are you really? Are you really a monotheist? Do you believe that the Father is God, and Jesus is God, and the Holy Spirit is God? Yeah. Sounds like poly to me. Or at least try. T-R-I. Well, triune. Tri is not mono. Tri is three and mono is one. A tricycle has three wheels and a mono has one. Called a uni, but it's the same thing. Well, they had a belief in one God, and his name was Yahweh. Y-A-H-W-E-H, same as the Jewish people. That should come as no surprise. So there's no syncretism here. They do not worship other gods. There's no paganism here. They aren't worshiping the pantheon of the Greeks or Romans to come, or the Babylonians who have already come and gone, or anyone that's current at that time. No syncretism, no paganism, no pantheism, none of the isms except the monotheism. As a matter of fact, they were so insistent on their one God worship, they desired to be so pure in their worship of one God, G-O-D, one God, that they were much more strict than the Jews in disallowing even anthropomorphisms. Anthropomorphisms, any type of human representation of the deity. Now, the Old Testament is just filled with these. The Lord's hand is not short, that he cannot save, neither his ear dull or heavy, that he cannot hear. And you've got very crass ones, probably the most crass one that I can think of off the top of my head anyway, that Moses gives us in Exodus chapter 15, talking about the breath blown from God's nostrils that parted the Red Sea. That is a crude anthropomorphism. Well, let me say it another way. That's a semi-crude anthropomorphism. because you could, of course, think of others, such as describing God with having sexual parts. That would be a truly crude anthropomorphism. The Bible doesn't do that. The Jews never did that. But the Jews did permit anthropomorphic language, speaking of God's eyes, his heart, his hair is white as wool, his feet, his arm, his hands, that he moved spatially, geographically, locally, because doesn't it say in the Psalms, and he rode on the wings of a cherub? So it has God represented with human language. And that was totally taboo with the Samaritan people. They truly worshiped one God, and he was God, not a big man. He was God. And since he was God, he had no bodily parts. And so all anthropomorphic language was forbidden as far as the Samaritans were concerned. One thing I think you'll see through our study that we're going to do here tonight is the fact that they were much more strict or stringent, or you could even use the term legalistic, than the Jewish people were. And the Jewish people in their theology and religion were not exactly libertines from what we can see in the Gospels. They were very legalistic about things, and the Samaritans were much more so. Now, if you ask, well, what did the Samaritans do about the anthropomorphisms? Well, they did what some of the later Jewish writers do with the anthropomorphisms. And by the way, while I'm on this, we could say many things. Anthropomorphic language in the Old Testament, that is a problem for Old Testament theology proper. But it is a rather significant issue that has to be dealt with that we can't do here. You might just think, well, obviously it's just using human language to represent God. But you haven't hardly said anything. All you've done is define the term. That's just a definition of an anthropomorphism. But what about the use of anthropomorphisms, though? The Old Testament evidently is filled with them. The New Testament has a few of them, by the way. When I say by the way, I mean in contrast to the Old, not very many at all. Has a few of them. And of course, I'm not taking into consideration the incarnation where God became man. I'm talking about anthropomorphic language of God in the New Testament. But it's just over and over and over in the Old. It's a serious theological issue. I hate to call it a problem. I think I just did a few moments ago. Maybe a better term would be a serious issue to deal with. What actually is being said here? And if you're not thinking very deeply with me, then you still don't understand what I'm saying. All you can think of is, well, I can define the term, and so that's all that can be said because that's all that needs to be said. Well, all that is a definition. You can get definitions by looking in dictionaries. But dictionaries don't tell you generally any more than a definition. Why is it used, and is it proper, and what is being said by that? Does God have eyes and hands and feet? Well, if he doesn't, does he have a body? Well, if he doesn't, where is he then? How could man be made in his image? And man has a particular form to him. And if God doesn't have bodily parts, he can't sit. And if he can't sit, he can't be on a throne. And so there's no throne. And then there's no heaven. And then God doesn't occupy space. So pretty soon you have no God. But the other thing I was going to say, if you ask the question, well, this is more to our study tonight, ITP and Samaritanism, what does Samaritans do about those references? Well, as I just said, they did what some of the later rabbinical writers did. They simply take them out, or they change it, and they tone down the language. Now, you say later Jewish people, Jewish writers, yes. You see, this is something that's going to be taking place during the period between the Testaments. Just soon go ahead and mention it now. It may come up again in ITP when we look at Judaism, specifically in Jewish theology. But it is something that does begin to arise in the period between the Testaments, with the rabbis having their special notion concerning the ineffable name, covenant name of God in the Old Testament. They came to the belief that it was so sacred it could not be pronounced. Well, if you're not going to pronounce his name, I would think something even more serious than that to deal with would be bodily parts on God. I think that you would first want to give up any reference to bodily parts on God rather than a divine name of Yahweh. See, they gave that name up, Yahweh, because it was the divine name of God. And he has said in the Ten Commandments, don't bear or carry my name, use my name in vain. So the best way not to use it in vain is don't use it at all. But what about bodily parts, though? That's even more, according to that reasoning understanding, a profanation of the deity. God with eyes and a nose and teeth and a tongue? Now, I guess maybe the 20th century American Christianity, it's not anthropomorphisms are no problem. Why is that? It's because most Christians basically have the idea in their mind of God as a large man. At least the size of Atlas or Hercules, something on that order, but he's a big man. So when you think of bodily parts, it's no big problem. But for someone, and there just aren't that many out there, but for someone who's really steeped in the theology of the Bible and the theology of God, then that would pose terrific questions in your mind. Because if you have the right conception of God, he is the infinite being. I mean, we have a galaxy that's 100,000 light years across. Light traveling at the speed of 186,000 miles a second. And it's 100,000 light years across. And it is a speck in an almost infinite universe where there are countless billions of galaxies larger than ours that we call the Milky Way because of the way it looks on its side and the stars up there and so forth. And God is bigger than all of that. He fills all of that. The nearest galaxy to ours is 2 million Andromeda, 2 million light years away. You can see it with the naked eye barely on the right night if you know where to look. 2 million light years away. Now, light year, take a second and measure that. Whenever you go out there, you either have to measure in AUs, astronomical units, between the Earth and the Sun. There's 93 million miles. Well, that's just a speck. So you go beyond AUs to light years. And it's a measure of distance by virtue of time, is what you have. So you take 1 second, you can go 186,000 miles, all right? Then 2 seconds, double that. 3 seconds, another 186,000. We're talking about seconds now. 1, 2, 3. And we're saying the nearest galaxy is 2 million light years. That's a figure that no human being, including Einstein, could even comprehend. And that's just our neighbor, our closest galaxy. What are you going to do with those that these giant telescopes, Palomar is just nothing anymore with all these new things that they have, or the radio telescopes that they have? We discussed some of this back in creation. And they just go on and on and on. And they still don't reach the edge of space, if there is an edge to it. Now, the best theory says that space is on a curved plane. That's the way we understand things. I mean, we couldn't even comprehend something that goes on and on and on. But if you went far enough, of course, it's all hypothesis. Only God knows, and you'd end up behind yourself. You'd come right out behind you. But, of course, if you go at the speed of light, though, then a 100-foot spaceship shrinks to about 10 feet. But that's what happens at the speed of light. So how do we know that? Well, that's what the scientists tell us. I don't know. They don't know. No one can ever demonstrate it, that's for sure. You know, you'd shrink to 1/10 of your size. Well, we know things change whenever you go to the moon. I think you don't weigh as much. That's good for fat people to live on the moon. So maybe something else happens whenever you're going the speed of light.
Is there any serious question about any other things like, like you think of the sun, or we think of examples, but using things as God, like the mighty wind.
Okay, using other analogy besides bodily parts on a human being. No, because we can take, from these other things, like comparing him to the sun or to a sunset or to the rain or to a well, we can get right away that we're talking about some figurative image of him, a figurative representation. If it's a well, then, it's the fact that God quenches the spiritual need that we have. But to describe him with human bodily parts, since we are humans and we know how frail and corrupt and sinful we are, just became beyond their imagination for the Samaritan people as well as for the later Jewish rabbis. I had a text in mind over in Genesis 18, Genesis 18 verse 22, which I think I've shown you before. But what I was saying when I got off on the space business was the fact that, if we understand space like we do, as vast and immense and almost infinite as it is. And of course, a lot of people don't probably spend enough time thinking about that. David certainly did in Psalm 8, whenever I consider all of this creative handiwork of yours, and what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him, Psalm 8, verses 2 to 4. That gives us a good conception of the God of Scripture then. And for those of us who think that way, then to think of God with bodily parts is very difficult. And the Jews, the more they thought about that, the more difficult it became to them. The more they understood that God, as the God that Solomon prayed to in 1 Kings 8, is the one who fills heaven and earth. Heaven and earth can't contain him. How much less so this little small house that I'm building here. It'd be like a house for a mouse compared to the infinite, nearly so, space out there that God has created. We haven't, no one knows how far it goes, and what they tell us is that all of these galaxies are going away from each other at tremendous rates of speed. Where are they going? Where are they going? You can measure things by the stars, called the Doppler effect. We've discussed that before in creation. The red effect that's named the Doppler effect. You can measure things. Everything seems to be moving away from each other at tremendous rates of speed. Now, this isn't just a yearly cycle. You know, we know we move away from things and then come back closer. This is a permanent moving away from them. And so, you know, it's hypothesized, well, if we're moving away from that galaxy and from the other, they're moving away from us, they're probably moving away from others, and we're moving away from others, and nothing's ever getting any closer. Everything is just expanding. You think, God with a nose and toes and a tongue? No way, that's just impossible. Of course, we know that the scripture writers aren't saying that he has those things. We understand that. They're using that to describe something about him. But even that becomes a little difficult.
Is it really only through these anthropomorphisms that we can really comprehend or know God through comparisons of things that we see or know about?
Well,
since we're so infinite?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the theories of epistemology, that we as human beings can't know anything but by comparison. And I think there's a lot of good points behind that. We can't know anything but by comparison. Whenever you try to tell your child something, as they're learning and growing, what do you have to say? This is like that. I mean, you can't just say this is that. They have no conception of it. How did you learn it the way it is? Someone told you this is like that. And your whole life is nothing but a building using millions of building blocks. You got to learn the things closest to you. And then you say, well, this is like that. Try to describe to a child, you know, something that they've never seen or done before. And how do you do it? You describe it by saying, this is like that. You look at your refrigerator, you look at the table and the legs on it, or something's curving. You say, now a snake, I'll tell you, a snake looks like this. It's because you've got something curved there. And then pretty soon, once they've got a snake, you say, well, a salamander is kind of like a snake, except it's got legs on it. Well, what's an alligator? Well, an alligator is like a salamander, but it's a lot bigger, though. And before you know it, you're just building blocks. And everything is described by everything else. That's for epistemology, how we know things. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and the study of how we know that we know things. And are we certain? Can we be certain? Can human beings be certain that they know what they think that they know? How do you know that red is really red, the color? How do you know that? Now, how can you prove that? You can't just say, well, obviously, look at it. Well, sight can be deceptive on many different occasions. That can be proven. You can get the little diagrams on, you know, in school books or something, asking which line is longer than the other just because they're drawn a certain way, or is this box bigger than that box because one is out in the open and one is put in a cluttered room, and they're exactly the same size. But the other things around them affect, well, maybe it's something in the atmosphere that's affecting so that you look and see red when really it's blue. Colorblind people do that, but maybe they've got the true sight, though. So, there's someone that's colorblind. So, epistemology asks and attempts to answer some of these things. Fascinating area. But to answer your question, if that's how we learn natural things, so we can only learn natural things by comparison, how much more so infinite things like God? I think I was in Genesis 18:22. The men turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom, and here's what the Hebrew says. But the Lord stood yet before Abraham. But the Lord stood yet before Abraham. Well, standing before is like a supplicant, a suppliant. Standing before the master, standing before, or the slave standing before the master, waiting for his next bidding or question. And the rabbis had a hard time with that, and this has been changed somewhere in textual history so that we have Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And that's really not what the Hebrew has. The Hebrew has it just the reverse. But a lot of the later manuscripts have this, as we have in the KJV, and the KJV picked it up this way because, it reads better to human understanding. Abraham stood yet before the Lord, instead of reversing that. So several different things happened during the intertestamental period. One, a ruling out of anthropomorphisms, especially by the Samaritans, but the Jews are picking it up around this time as well. That was our first point, one God. Let's go on. Only what he gave us, since he was the anointed lawgiver of the Old Covenant, is valid as Scripture in the Old Testament. That's the Samaritan view. There's one lawgiver, not many different lawgivers or prophets running around. There's one lawgiver, one prophet. His name was Moses. Only what he gave us is what God gave us. And the closest thing to Moses, they would say, would be his immediate successor, Joshua. And so the book of Joshua, although not counted it canonical by the Samaritans, is very highly regarded, the book of Joshua. You end up with a hexateuch instead of a pentateuch, 6 books instead of 5. They were even more strict than the Jews when it came to the law because of their great faith in the man Moses as God's prophet. This was especially true of the Sabbath. They were more stringent in Sabbath law and restriction than were the Jewish people. According to Leviticus 23, they had 3 great annual sacred seasons, or sometimes they're called festivals. Here they'd be Samaritan festivals. And those were Passover. By the way, Leviticus 23, I think, gives us about 8. If you count starting with the Sabbath and go all the way through, what is the last one? I'd have to look it up. Tabernacles, I think. But anyway, they've got 3. Passover, which is the second one in the list. Atonement, which I would guess would be the 7th one, and Tabernacles, which I think is the 8th one. It doesn't matter because we're not studying what the Jews had. But yes, that's right, what I gave you. Numbers 2, 7, and 8 in Leviticus 23 were their great annual festivals. Passover, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles. Now, Passover, Day of Atonement, which were important ones because they involved sacrifice, they didn't die out with the destruction of their temple. They would simply make an annual pilgrimage right up the slopes of Gerizim. If I can remember, I'm going to bring a picture later on and show you that. I have a picture in one of the volumes of my library of one of their annual pilgrimages up to the top of Gerizim, where several lambs would be slain and prepared and eaten, as in the Passover, or simply slain as in the Day of Atonement. But essentially they follow the same pattern as the Jewish people, or as you'd be familiar with in the Old Testament. Now, let me say something else under lawgiver. We're on the concept of oneness here. One lawgiver. That doesn't rule out priests. They do have, and they do believe in priests, their own priest. I brought along a picture of their high priest several years ago. I'm not for sure if he's still alive, but his name was Amram. And this is a picture of him. But when you've seen one Samaritan old man, you've seen them all. I guess the same is true with the Jewish people. But there's Amram, the Samaritan high priest. They had their own priesthood. Descended from Aaron, they believed. Good biblical name there, Amram. By the way, this is in Erdman's Handbook to the Bible. Some of you have that. I have an old copy of it. I've had mine, many years, 7 years, and I know they've revised it once or twice since I bought mine, so probably no sense in giving the page number because I don't know how similar they are. And you can find that picture elsewhere. Then number 3, let's go on to one book. One lawgiver would then lead into a discussion of one book. One lawgiver is Moses. One book would be the Pentateuch. That is their Bible. The Torah in their non-Masoretic recension. Non-Masoretic. The Jewish is a Masoretic, done by the Masoretes. A non-Masoretic recension of the Pentateuch. Now, we don't know... Yes. Genesis through Deuteronomy, 5 books, the Pentateuch. Not Joshua, but I've said before that Joshua was highly regarded by them. They don't have a hexateuch, but they would come closer to having Joshua if they had a hexateuch than anything else. And that was simply because he was Moses' successor, so he couldn't be too far off base. He couldn't have ended up in heresy like the rest of the leaders, Samuel, Eli, Solomon, all those guys did. Isaiah, you have to list all of them. The ones that wrote Scripture, they're all wrong, except Moses and probably his successor, Joshua. Now, we don't know if in the beginning this notion of one book restricted to the Torah was intended or not. No one really knows how early this goes in Samaritan history. In other words, here's what I mean by that. Perhaps the returning teaching priest, remember, of 2 Kings 17, perhaps he could only obtain a copy of the law. Remember, they didn't have books like we had, the whole Bible in one book here. It's all scrolls. You have to have a moving van to carry the things around. And you couldn't get the whole Pentateuch on one scroll. You probably couldn't get one whole Genesis on one scroll. You'd have to have several for a book like that. And so, with all of the upheaval, at the fall of the northern kingdom, and you've got a priest who's been taken to, some foreign land, and they ask, bring back one of the priests that he might teach us the way of Yahweh so we can keep these lines off our back. Well, he's not going to have a whole copy of however much of the Old Testament. Of course, not all of it's available. More than the Pentateuch is available then. He's not going to have a whole copy of that with him. Perhaps all he could get his hands on was a copy of the Pentateuch. This is just speculation. No one knows. I'm just saying this is a suggestion that could have been true, why they started off having only that. And then, of course, later had developed their theology, and it just so happened that it coincided neatly with the fact all they have is a Pentateuch, so they don't have to deal with the rest of the Old Testament, which teaches totally contrary to what their beliefs were, as we've seen earlier. So perhaps the returning teaching priests could only obtain a copy of the Pentateuch. And that's what they grew up with for a number of years until they could obtain more, and by then they chose not to. But in any event, the doctrine was definitely established by later years. When I say later years, I mean by the ITP, intertestamental period. And of course, they simply had to establish this as their doctrine because so much of the rest of the Old Testament contradicts the Samaritan view of their own origin and history. The whole Old Testament contradicts that. But when you have to get past the Pentateuch before you really have some serious problems. The Pentateuch, you could deal with a few problems there, but it's still projecting and predicting things in the future. Whenever you've already got them established, and God talking through Samuel and establishing the priesthood and establishing the kingship, and God talking to David and blessing him and telling Solomon to build the temple, well, that contradicts all Samaritan history. So you couldn't have that in your library. Now, on our biblical literature tape, number 51, we've thoroughly discussed the Samaritan Pentateuch. It is a valuable witness to the Old Testament text. but we've already discussed its history at length on Lit Tape 51. Then in the fourth place, we would come to one holy place. Notice each time I'm using the word one. One God, one lawgiver, one book, one holy place, which was Mount Gerizim. Gerizim. Probably better pronounced Gerizim, but the KJV I think has it accented as Gerizim, and so that's just one of those words you pick up, emphasizing the middle syllable instead of the last. Now, you're going to need your Old Testament here for a little while. If you go back into Deuteronomy and Joshua, and get back in that general area, we got several passages to look at. Moses had told the people, the book of Deuteronomy, when they were still on the east side of the Jordan River, that once they entered the Promised Land, they were to hold a religious ceremony on two mountains. Now, he very specifically tells them this. A religious ceremony was to be held on two mountains. Moses was familiar enough with the geography, although he had never been there. He was familiar enough with the geography of Palestine to know these two mountains, those being Gerizim and Ebal, E-B-A-L, and to tell them that they were to hold a religious ceremony there, a ceremony, in essence, of introduction into the land. They were to recite blessings and curses, Deuteronomy 27 and 28. See if you got all your facts here. Which mountain for the blessings? Which for the curses? Gerizim for the blessings, Mount Ebal for the curses. Which one's north and which one's south? Ebal is north, Gerizim south. Maybe it'll be good to have this ahead of our, let's see, if we give ourselves, we'll have to kind of draw a circle. There's Ebal. They're real close to one another. There's Gerizim. Here's the city of Samaria, the capital up here. City of Shechem. It's pretty much right in between. I got right here. Like about there. This is Ebal. This is Gerizim. So Moses is talking to them over here. Here's the Jordan River, east of the Jordan River. He tells this to them in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 29. In one little verse, it's mentioned, and of course he elaborates on this later in his sermon. Deuteronomy is composed of 3 sermons that he delivers on the plains of Moab just before they go into the Promised Land during about a 40-day period. Just one verse is mentioned here, and then it's picked up later on. It's in the context, though, of blessing and curses. Look at verse 26 to begin with, Deuteronomy 11. Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. Now see if this isn't similar to our Wednesday night studies on obedience and doing the will of God. A blessing if you obey, and a curse if ye will not obey. And it shall come to pass, and what those blessings and curses are, we're told over in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. And they include all different types of things. And why would they differ for a Christian today? God's blessings and curses don't differ. He promises health, he promises deliverance, he promises a large family, he promises blessing for the family. All of those things are promised over there.
Amen.
And they don't change. The blessings of God don't change. Blessing if you obey, a curse if you will not obey. Verse 29, and it will come to pass when the Lord thy God hath brought thee in. Now notice the tense there. See, he's looking forward to this, knowing himself that he will not participate in it. Hath brought thee forth. When he hath brought thee forth into the land, thou shalt put the blessing upon Mount Gerizim and the curse upon Mount Ebal. Well, he doesn't mean go bless Gerizim and curse Ebal. You wouldn't really know what he's talking about here if we didn't have the rest of Deuteronomy. Put the people on Mount Gerizim who are going to speak the blessings, and on Mount Ebal who are going to speak the curse. All right, that's also Deuteronomy 27, verses 12 to 13. He divides the tribes up for them here. These shall stand upon Mount Gerizim to bless the people when they come over Jordan. He names tribes. Verse 13, these shall stand upon Mount Ebal to curse. He names the tribes. And then Deuteronomy 27:14 starts some of the curses, and then you go over into chapter 28, and we're to blessings, and then later in chapter 28, curses. So it goes curses, blessing, curses. And also, you can just jot this down, Joshua 8:33, which is, by the way, the fulfillment, the enactment of Deuteronomy 11 and 27. Joshua 8:33. Moses said, do it when you get there. Joshua 8 is a record of them doing what God said do when you get there. Now, let me ask you another question. You're about 50%, I guess, on where the blessings and curses go, and which one's north or south. That's pretty good. You didn't know your geography, but you know that the blessings go on Gerizim. All right, let's go to another question. The blessings go on Gerizim. Let's put that out here. Well, I kind of give it away sometimes when I pose questions with all of this introductory material. But he's going to tell them to build, well, he does earlier in chapter 27, prior to verses 12 and 13 that we just read. He's going to tell them to build an altar, to do sacrifice on. Well, upon which mountain would you suspect that the altar would go? Gerizim. You would expect, obviously it doesn't, or I wouldn't be saying it this way, you would expect the altar to be built on Gerizim, because I think we generally connect altars with blessings. However, the altar was to be built on Ebal. Deuteronomy 27:4, Joshua 8:30 and 31. Therefore it shall be, when ye be gone over Jordan, ye shall set these stones which I command you this day in Mount Ebal. Where? Mount Ebal. And plaster them with plaster. And then he goes on in verse 5 to say, and build an altar unto the Lord your God. Now let's read the Joshua passage. Now I'm going to be saying something about this. We're leading up to say something. Joshua 8, beginning with verse 30. Joshua built an altar unto the Lord God of Israel in Mount Ebal, strictly following what Moses had taught them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded the children of Israel, as it's written in the book of the law of Moses. An altar of stones and so forth. They offered thereon burnt offerings unto the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings on the mountain, which was the mountain of the curses. Well, you see, the Samaritans noticed this situation here, and so they got their logic into it and said, well, now, here's what's happened. It doesn't make sense to build an altar on the mountain of curses, Mount Ebal. So what the Jews have done is they've corrupted the Bible. They've corrupted the law of God. What Moses told them to do was build an altar on Mount Gerizim, since that was the blessing mountain. And Israel's copies of the Torah gave evil, and so the Samaritans charged Israel with the fact that they had changed the text and corrupted it. Now, furthermore, all building up here, if a temple was going to be built as the one recognized place of worship for God, would God wait 500 years to tell them about it? Till the time of Solomon? That's 500 years later. So again, the Samaritans get their logic into it and say, well, that doesn't make sense either. First, for an altar to be built on the mountain of curses, and secondly, for God to delay telling them about the temple, which was the center of their liturgy and worship, delay telling them for a half a millennium, 500 years. So then they combine these two branches of knowledge, or really speculation, and came up with this. Well, Jerusalem could never be sanctified as the place for the worship of God. Neither could Ebal, because it was the Mount of Curses. but rather Gerizim was intended by God to be the holy mountain in the Old Testament. Now that is how they reconstructed the history and worked backward, as it were. We don't have, because we don't have the material in the period between the Testaments, any type of specific, documentation of all of this. But this is simply how the Samaritans, down to this day, Samaritans are still alive, and the Samaritan high priest will still give you this argument, or not just high priest, the priest will still give you this argument as to why Gerizim, in their opinion, should be the holy mountain. Now, one problem, though, with that theory, and with their acceptance of the Pentateuch as their one book, is the fact that the Pentateuch spoke in the future tense of a place that God will choose. The place's name, and it speaks in the future tense after Deuteronomy 11, where God said that Gerizim will be the Mount of Blessing. That's why it's very important to have these scriptures and these thoughts in order, in chronological order, sequential order in your mind, or it doesn't prove as much as it could prove otherwise. Let me say that again, that the Pentateuch, after Deuteronomy 11, speaks in the future tense of a place where God would choose to place his name. In other words, by implication, it wouldn't be Gerizim, because he has the opportunity to say, now, remember that mountain I just said in Deuteronomy 11:29 was the Mount of Blessing, Gerizim? Well, that's the holy mount, that's the holy mount, that's the holy mount. And it's always, I will put, the place that I will show you. By implication, I haven't shown you yet what that place is or where that place will be. For instance, Deuteronomy chapter 12. See, we're one chapter later, so it's important to know Deuteronomy 11:29 along with Deuteronomy 12:5. Deuteronomy 12:5. But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose, what shall choose? Out of all your tribes to put his name there, even unto his habitation shall ye seek, and thither shalt thou come. Now for a Jew, that's a prediction of the temple 500 years ahead of time. And for a Christian it is. You can tell what he's talking about. The place that God will put his name for all your tribes, that you can seek him at his habitation, well, that's the temple of King Solomon. And the tense is future. God shall choose. Now, he's already chosen Gerizim as the Mount of Blessing. But you see, that's for introduction into the land. That's past tense. He has already chosen Gerizim as the place of blessing. That has nothing to do with the Deuteronomy 12:5 temple building, though. That's another thing, another issue that we're talking about here. Then in chapter 16, it is just found over and over and over again. Note these verses, 2, 6, 7, 15, 16. Those are the ones that I see. I have them marked here. Look with me, those verses. Deuteronomy 16:2, in the place which the Lord shall choose. Verse 6, at the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Verse 7, in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Verse 15, in the place which the Lord shall choose. Verse 16, in the place which he shall choose. You notice that over and over and over? There are 19 places, I think I've counted them all. There are 19 places, the Pentateuch, where the Samaritans went back, and in their recension, they changed the verb tense to a past tense. In the place which the Lord has chosen. Meaning what place? Mount Gerizim. Okay, and that gives them proof for the sacred place to build their temple. Now this is important to remember what I'm saying right here. In 19 such places, where in the Jewish Christian Old Testament, Moses predicts the building of the temple in a certain unspecified, unidentified place. God said, I'll show you where later. In other words, I'm not going to reveal it to you now. I'll reveal that to you later. The Samaritans go back and change the verb tense to put it in the past, to conform to their interpretation of Deuteronomy 11:29. And to conform to their logic of why wait 500 years before you tell the people through Solomon to build a temple. Two different streams of thought here. The logic of why wait 500 years to tell Solomon to do it. I mean, why not, as soon as you go into the land, the logic would say, build a temple to the Lord. They wait a half a millennium. As well as their interpretation of chapter 11 and verse 29. Plus, they go back and add an 11th commandment. You didn't know there were 11? 10 commandments? No, the Samaritans have 11 commandments. They stick one on after Exodus 20:17. I wonder what that is. Well, I would have to tell you what the 11th commandment is. Now that temple, you see, they go back, as I'm saying here, and change their holy law. That temple, as we've seen before, was built back in the end of the 4th century B.C. on the northern peak of Gerizim. Now what I had some slides that I just decided not to bring them. I've been there, so I've got slides of all of this, but I'll just have to wait. It's too much trouble to bring that just to show you a couple. But I did bring a picture. This bottom picture is looking south. So if you're taking the picture, immediately behind your back is Mount Ebal, because Ebal is to the north. You're looking south through, well, you're right at the well of Jacob. It's not exactly in the picture, but that's about where the well of Jacob is. And you're looking at Mount Gerizim. Just to give you a little idea, I mean, it's not like the Rocky Mountains. It's just like a hill. You can see grass and everything growing on top. It's about 1,000 feet up, I guess. They built a temple about 1,000 feet up the northern peak of Mount Gerizim. I'll pass this around afterwards, because only those really up close can see it. Then we've said it was destroyed by John Hyrcanus, 128 B.C., and that really alienated the people. And we're talking about one holy place, Gerizim, and their temple. Its ruins, I have some other pictures of this, but they weren't the best. They were black and white, so I didn't bring them. We didn't climb to Mount Gerizim whenever we were there. We were too busy descending and drinking out of Jacob's well. If I had my pick, I'd rather go to Jacob's well than the Samaritan holy place. I'd rather do both, but you can't with a lot of old people who don't want to climb mountains. So its ruins, however, can still be seen today. They were investigated in 1966 by archaeologists and 1968. 1966 and 1968, the ruins of the ancient Samaritan temple were investigated. As I said, it's built 1,000 feet above Shechem, ancient important patriarchal city. 1,000 feet above Shechem on the northern peak of Gerizim. Now, through the years, of course, everybody's tried to do something. The Romans, under Hadrian, built a temple to Zeus on top of the ruins of the Samaritan temple. The Samaritans haven't thought very highly of that for all these years. And then the Christians in the 4th century, quote-unquote Christians, came along and built some holy shrine on the top of it. It's been desecrated as far as the Samaritans are concerned many times. And then the Crusaders came in the 1100s and built a church over it. And then the Turks came and destroyed that. In the 1800s or so, I think, the Greek Orthodox came and started to build a church, and they got about halfway through and they stopped. And that's what's there today. It's a Greek Orthodox church. And down in the crypt of the church, where you hide the holy and sacred things, down in the crypt of the church is Jacob's well. But back up to the top of the mountain. The major feature that can still be seen today is a gigantic, I'm talking about the temple on Gerizim, a gigantic solid stone altar podium. 65 feet by 65 feet by 25 feet high. You could do your sacrifice. Well, you could do just about everything. You could build a city on top of that. 65 by 65 by 25 feet high, solid stone, carved out of rock, solid stone altar or podium. Now their temple, after it was destroyed by Hyrcanus in 128 BC, it was never rebuilt. and they simply moved their worship into the synagogue. They went to synagogal worship just like the Jews had to. But they were forced to do that a little later than the Jews. The Jews were in synagogues way back in early years. And then, of course, continued throughout the New Testament period as well. Then let me conclude with one other note on oneness. They believe in one Messiah. One Messiah, but regretfully his name is Tahi. He will appear from the tribe of Joseph, and he is yet to come. So, sadly, the Samaritans have missed the Messiah just as the Jews have. They're still looking for him. I think one woman found him, though, back in John 4. But most of them have missed him. They're looking not for Jesus, but Tahiv.
You apply that 1 Corinthians passage to them also, if the veil is over their eyes?
It may be true. May be true. Specifically Jewish people, but the Samaritans have a stake in that claim as well, I think. So they're looking for one Messiah. They believe in one God, whose name is Yahweh. They're looking for his Messiah, whose name is Tahiv.